The night before my tuition was due, $60,000 vanished from my account with a single bank notification. My parents called it family money, necessary for my sister's dream wedding in Europe. 3 months later, as the semester started, they called again, not to apologize, but to beg for a piece of the future they had stolen. Finally, I was the one holding the knife. My name is Jasmine Jones, and until the clock struck 11:45 on a humid Tuesday night, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I was 22 years old, sitting on the edge of a mattress that smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust, inside a studio apartment that cost less per month than my mother spent on her weekly facials. I was tired. My back ached from a double shift at the data entry firm, and the air conditioning unit in the window rattled like a dying engine. But I was free, or so I told myself. I had grown up in Willow Ridge, a zip code just outside of Dallas where the driveways are paved with imported stone and the secrets are buried under layers of manicured Bermuda grass. In Willow Ridge, money was not something you earned. It was something you breathed. It was an atmosphere, not a currency. But I had rejected that ecosystem. I had spent the last 4 years distinct from my family, carving out a path that did not rely on Gregory and Lydia Jones's conditional generosity. I had taken a gap year that turned into 3 years of grueling work, hoarding every cent, driving a sedan with a broken compressor through the suffocating Texas summers, all to avoid the shackles of student debt. Tomorrow was the deadline. The tuition for my first semester as a returning full-time student was due at noon. I had the money. It was sitting in a high-yield savings account I had named Freedom, a sum of $62,400 and change. It was enough to cover the first 2 years and part of the third if I kept working weekends. The phone buzzed against the nightstand. The screen lit up, casting a harsh, artificial blue glow across the peeling paint of my wall. It was a notification from the bank. Usually, these were mundane, a reminder of a scheduled transfer or a monthly statement availability, but the text preview was too long. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and picked it up, my thumb hovering over the glass. Transfer confirmation. $62,000 transferred to Savannah Coastal Wedding Fund. I stared at the screen. The numbers refused to make sense. It had to be a glitch, a banking error, perhaps a display bug. I sat up straight, the cheap sheets tangling around my legs, and opened the banking app. My fingers were steady, but my heart had stopped beating in its usual rhythm. It was a heavy, thudding pause in my chest. I logged in. The loading circle spun for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Balance, $412. I tapped the transaction history, my breath hitching in my throat. There it was. A transfer initiated 4 minutes ago. The destination account was external, but the label was manually entered. Savannah Coastal Wedding Fund. I knew that name. Savannah was where my sister, Brooke, had wanted her first wedding 3 years ago before she pivoted to a vineyard in Napa. The fund name was an old relic, a recycled bucket for burning cash. I tapped for more details. Authorized by joint owner. The air in the room seemed to vanish. When I turned 18, my father, Gregory, had insisted on remaining on the account. He had called it a safety measure, a way to transfer emergency funds if I ever got into trouble with my car or health. He had looked me in the eye, standing in the marble foyer of our family home, and promised he would never touch it. He said it was just a formality, a ghost key that would never be turned. I sat there, the phone burning my palm. That number, 62,000, was not just digits on a screen. It was the summer of 2020, when the pavement in Dallas was hot enough to melt rubber, and I drove a delivery route without air conditioning, sweating until my clothes were fused to my skin. It was 4 years of Friday nights spent in a windowless back office of a tax firm, filing returns for strangers while my friends were at concerts or bars. It was the vacations I declined, the clothes I patched instead of replaced, the lunches I skipped. It was thousands of hours of saying no to the present so I could say yes to the future. And in 1 second, with one tap of a finger on a screen in Willow Ridge, it was gone. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not call the police, though perhaps I should have. Instead, a sensation of absolute zero took hold of me. It started in my stomach and spread outward to my fingertips, numbing everything it touched. It was a cold, clinical clarity. I realized then that to Gregory and Lydia, I was not a daughter. I was a rainy day fund. I was a liquidity option. I opened Instagram. My thumb moved automatically, seeking confirmation of the madness. I went to Brooke's profile. There was a new story, posted 20 minutes ago. The video was shaky, likely filmed by my mother. It showed Brooke holding up a sample of heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of champagne in her hand. The background was the familiar, expansive living room of the Willow Ridge house, with its floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the infinity pool. The caption was written in a swirling, elegant font. Because a princess deserves a sequel. Wedding 2.0 in Santorini is officially a go. Who says you can't say I do twice? Santorini. They had drained the blood from my life to buy champagne in Greece. My sister Brooke was 26. She had been married once already, a lavish affair that lasted 14 months before she got bored. Her husband, Colton, was a man who described himself as an entrepreneur, but mostly just moved his parents' money around. Now, apparently, they needed a renewal of vows, a fresh start in the Mediterranean, and they needed my tuition to pay for it. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was not just theft. It was a dismissal of my existence. They knew the deadline was tomorrow. They knew how hard I had worked. They simply did not care. In the economy of the Jones family, Brooke's whims were essential expenditures, and my education was a luxury that could be liquidated. I set the phone down on the mattress. The silence in my apartment was heavy, amplified by the rhythmic rattle of the air conditioner. For years, I had told myself that if I just worked hard enough, if I just proved I could stand on my own 2 feet, they would respect me. I thought that by not asking them for money, I was earning their admiration. I thought I was building a boundary they could not cross. I was wrong. I hadn't built a boundary. I had built a treasury for them to raid. I looked at my hands. They were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of realization. I was done. I whispered into the dark room, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Okay. Just one word. I was not going to call them and beg. I was not going to cry and ask how they could do this. That was what the old Jasmine would have done. The daughter who sought approval would have asked for an explanation. But the daughter who sought approval died the moment that balance hit $400. I stood up and walked to the small window. Outside, the streetlights of Fort Worth hummed with an orange haze. Far to the east lay Willow Ridge, nestled in its gated security and manicured silence. They were probably sleeping now, or perhaps they were packing. They were comfortable in their glass and stone fortress, secure in the belief that Jasmine would figure it out. Jasmine always figured it out. Jasmine was the strong one, the worker, the mule. They thought they could harvest my effort, and I would simply grow it back next season like a crop. This time was different. I turned away from the window and lay back down on the bed. But I did not close my eyes. I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows of passing cars sweep across the plaster. Tomorrow, I would go to Willow Ridge. I would not go as a petitioner. I would not go as a victim. I would walk into that house, the house they loved more than they loved me, and I would make sure they understood that the Bank of Jasmine was closed forever. They had taken my money. They had taken my next 4 years. They had tried to take my future to fund a party. I reached out and turned off my phone completely, silencing the digital world. As the screen went black, shutting out the image of Brooke's champagne and the zero balance of my account. A new plan began to form in the quiet dark of my mind. It was not a plan for tuition. It was not a plan for a degree. It was a blueprint for a life where their hands could never reach me again. I lay there, perfectly still, while the anger hardened into something useful, something sharp and durable. I would face them in the morning, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of losing their love. I was only interested in collecting what I was owed. even if the currency had changed from dollars to consequences. The morning sun over Willow Ridge was aggressive, a blinding white heat that bounced off the manicured lawns and the chrome bumpers of parked Range Rovers. I drove my 10-year-old sedan through the gates, the engine sputtering with a low, asthmatic wheeze that disrupted the neighborhood's carefully engineered silence. My car was a blemish here, a rusted scab on a perfect complexion, but I did not care. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned the color of bone, focusing on the destination ahead. My parents' house rose from the earth like a monument to modern excess. It was a sprawling structure of glass and white limestone, sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered no privacy because, in their world, visibility was the point. It looked less like a home and more like a showroom for high-end Italian furniture, a place where people posed rather than lived. I parked on the circular driveway, right behind a delivery van from a luxury caterer. I did not knock. I still had my key, a heavy piece of steel that felt foreign in my pocket now, like an artifact from a civilization I had already left. I pushed open the massive front door and stepped into the air-conditioned chill. The house smelled of expensive things, white orchids, roasted coffee beans, and the distinct, crisp scent of new leather. The foyer was a chaos of preparation. 4 large suitcases, shimmering in a pearl finish hardshell, lay open on the marble floor like dissected clams. They were overflowing with silk caftans, linen suits, and designer swimwear. My mother, Lydia, was kneeling beside one of the cases, folding a turquoise scarf with surgical precision. She did not look up when the door closed behind me. "If you are here to see us off, you are early," she said, her voice distracted. "The car is not coming for another 2 hours. And please, Jasmine, do not go upstairs and agitate Brooke. She is having a crisis about the humidity in Santorini affecting her hair, and I cannot deal with 2 hysterical daughters today." I stood rooted to the spot, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished stone. The contrast was nauseating. 12 hours ago, I was staring at a bank balance that could not buy a sandwich. Here, there was enough resort wear scattered on the floor to pay my rent for a year. "I am not here to say goodbye," I said. My voice was steady, lower than usual. "I am here because my tuition account is empty." Lydia paused, her hand hovering over a bottle of sunscreen. She finally looked up, her expression mild, unbothered. "Oh, that—" "Yes, that," I said, walking further into the room. $62,000, transferred without my permission. I want to know why." My father, Gregory, walked in from the kitchen. He was holding an iPad and wearing a cashmere pullover despite the Texas heat. He removed his reading glasses when he saw me, sighing as if I were a minor scheduling conflict he had to resolve before his flight. "Jasmine," he said, offering a tight, patronizing smile. "Lower your voice. The neighbors have ears, and we have the windows open in the sunroom." "I do not care about the neighbors. Dad, I care about the 4 years of work you liquidated last night." Gregory walked over to the kitchen island, tapping the screen of his tablet. "It is not liquidation, Jasmine. It is family cash flow optimization. We had a liquidity crunch. Brooke and Colton are currently tied up in a very promising luxury eco-resort development in Tulum. Their capital is frozen until the next quarter. We simply needed a bridge loan to cover the wedding expenses." "A bridge loan?" I repeated, the absurdity of the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You stole my tuition to pay for a party because Brooke's husband made a bad investment?" "It is a wedding, not a party," Lydia snapped, standing up and smoothing her white trousers. "And do not speak about Colton's business like that. You have always been jealous of them." "I am not jealous," I said. "I am broke. I start classes in 3 weeks. That money was not yours to touch. I worked double shifts for that. I drove a car with no air conditioning for 3 summers for that." Gregory poured himself a cup of coffee from the silver carafe, looking bored. "And that is exactly why we knew you could handle it. You are resilient. Jasmine, you are the smart one. You figure things out. That is your gift." He said it like it was a compliment, a badge of honor. "Brooke is different," Lydia chimed in, her tone softening as she spoke her favorite daughter's name. She is more fragile. She needs this wedding to be perfect. She has been under so much stress with the rebranding of her lifestyle blog. We could not let her down. Family helps family. Family helps family? I laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any humor. When have you ever helped me? I paid for my own car. I paid for my own insurance. I moved out because you wanted to turn my room into a Pilates studio. And now, when I finally saved enough to secure my own future, you took it because Brooke wanted a destination wedding in Greece. Lydia's face hardened. She took a step toward me, her eyes narrowing. You ungrateful girl, do not talk to us about money. Who paid for your private high school? Who bought your clothes for 18 years? Who paid for those piano lessons you hated? We invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in raising you, and now you stand here, quibbling over a temporary transfer, acting like we are thieves? You are thieves, I said. If a stranger did this, I would call the police. The only reason I haven't is because we share a last name. You are being selfish, Lydia spat. You are young. You can work. You can take a semester off. You can get a loan. Brooke cannot wait. The deposits were non-refundable. I looked at them, really looked at them, for years. I had thought their neglect was just a parenting style, a byproduct of their busy social lives. But standing there, surrounded by the smell of their wealth, I realized it was functional, to them. I was not a person with dreams. I was an asset. I was the draft horse they kept in the stable, sturdy and ignored, expected to pull the cart whenever the show pony stumbled. They did not steal from me because they hated me. They stole from me because they did not believe I needed the money. In their minds, I was designed to suffer and survive. Brooke was designed to shine and consume. When will you pay it back? I asked. I needed to hear them say it. Gregory took a sip of his coffee, looking out the window at the pool. When the Tulum project yields a return, the market is a bit volatile right now, but we are optimistic about the third quarter of next year. Next year? I felt the blood draining from my face. Tuition is due today, not next year. Gregory shrugged. It was a small, elegant movement of his shoulders. Then you will figure something out, or consider it your contribution to your sister's happiness. Don't be petty, Jasmine. It does not suit you. Petty. My life, my sweat, my sleepless nights, all reduced to pettiness because it inconvenienced their fantasy. I reached into the pocket of my jeans. My fingers closed around the cold steel of the house key. It had a little keychain attached to it, a miniature Eiffel Tower from a trip they took without me when I was 12. I pulled it out. So that is it, I said quietly. I am just the insurance policy. Stop being dramatic, Lydia said, turning back to her suitcase. We are going to miss our flight. Go home, Jasmine. We will talk about this when we get back in 3 weeks. No, I said. We won't. I raised my hand and let the key drop. It hit the white stone coffee table with a sharp, violent clatter. The sound was incredibly loud in the cavernous room, cutting through the hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of the pool filter. It sounded like a gunshot made of metal. Gregory flinched. Lydia froze. What are you doing? Gregory asked, looking at the key sitting alone on the pristine marble surface. I am resigning, I said. From this family. From being your backup plan. From being the one you use to subsidize your delusions. I looked my father in the eye. For the first time, he didn't look bored. He looked confused. From this moment on, I said, my voice vibrating with a cold intensity I didn't know I possessed. You do not have the right to touch anything with my name on it. You do not have a daughter to bail you out. You have Brooke. You have the wedding. You have the debt. Keep them. I turned around. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my legs felt light, unburdened. If you walk out of this house, Lydia screamed, her voice cracking with a sudden, ugly desperation, do not expect to ever come back. We will cut you off completely. I stopped at the door, my hand on the heavy brass handle. I looked back at the pearl suitcases, the orchids, the parents who love their image more than their child. "You already cut me off, Mother," I said. "You just expected me to keep paying for the privilege of being ignored." "Get out!" she shrieked. "Gladly," I replied. "I need a different door, one that does not lead back to this." I walked out into the blinding Texas heat. The door clicked shut behind me, a heavy final sound that echoed in the driveway. I got into my car, the seats burning my legs through my jeans, and turned the key. The engine coughed and then roared to life. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I drove through the gates of Willow Ridge. I left the stone mansion behind, knowing that while my bank account was empty, for the first time in 22 years, the ledger was finally clear. I owed them nothing, and they would soon realize that without their draft horse, the carriage was very heavy indeed. I drove straight to the bank. It was a sterile, glass-walled branch nestled between a smoothie shop and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that played soft jazz to keep people calm while they discussed their debts. I walked in, feeling the sweat drying cold on my back, and sat down at the desk of a personal banker named Mia. She was about my age, wearing a polyester blazer that looked uncomfortable, and she had the tired eyes of someone who had already explained 3 overdraft fees that morning. I placed my debit card on the desk. "I need to close this account," I said, "and I need to open a new one that nobody else can see." Mia typed something into her computer, her long acrylic nails clicking against the keys like a rhythmic code. She frowned at the screen. "You are aware that Gregory Jones is a joint owner on this checking account?" she asked. "As a joint owner, he has full survivorship rights and access privileges. If you close this, we usually recommend informing all parties to avoid declined auto payments." I looked at her. "I am aware," I said. "That is exactly why I'm closing it." He exercised his access privileges last night to empty it. Mia stopped typing. She looked from the screen to my face, reading the exhaustion and the redness in my eyes that I had tried to hide. Her professional mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of genuine sympathy. "I understand," she said quietly. "Let's shut it down." We went through the process. It felt like performing an exorcism on a spreadsheet. We severed the connection. We revoked the permissions. When it was done, she handed me a cashier's check for the remaining balance, $812.40. That was it. That was the sum total of my life's worth after the raid. She then opened a new account. Sole ownership, no parents, no safety nets that turned into traps. She printed a temporary debit card and slid it across the desk. It was a flat, matte gray. It was the ugliest card I had ever seen, and it was beautiful. It looked like a shield. I walked out to my car and sat in the driver's seat. The engine was off. The heat was baking the dashboard. I took my phone out of my pocket. It had been vibrating intermittently with messages from Brooke, likely complaining about my scene at the house, and missed calls from my mother. I opened the contact list. First, Gregory, block, next, Lydia, block, then Brooke, block, and finally, Colton, block. I stared at the screen. Usually, my phone was a source of constant anxiety. It was a leash. It was where the demands came in, where the guilt trips were coordinated, where I was told to pick up dry cleaning or transfer money for a group gift I was never thanked for. Now it was silent. It was a terrifying silence. It felt like I had just cut the rope holding me to the side of a cliff. But as I sat there, breathing in the hot, stale air of the sedan, I realized something else. I was not falling. I was just floating. I had $800. I had no place to live. As my current lease was up in 3 days, and I certainly could not afford the renewal rate without the tuition money I had planned to use for rent subsidies, I had no family. I started the car. I needed a roof. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in a coffee shop, using their free Wi-Fi to scour the darkest corners of the internet for housing. My standards dropped with every hour that passed. Willow Ridge was out. North Dallas was out. Even the student housing near the campus was too expensive without a cosigner, and there was no way in hell I was asking Gregory to sign anything ever again. I found it on a community bulletin board website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. Attic efficiency for rent. Fort Worth. Above commercial business. Cash weekly. No credit check. $300 a month. It sounded like the beginning of a horror movie, but $300 was a number I could respect. I drove 40 minutes west, leaving the manicured suburbs behind for a neighborhood where the fences were chain link and the grass was mostly dirt. The address led me to a building made of cinder blocks painted appealing turquoise. A neon sign in the window buzzed with a dying electrical hum. Suds and Duds Laundromat. Open 24/7. The landlord was a man named Mr. Henderson, who chewed on an unlit cigar and looked at me like I was a lost tourist. He didn't ask for references. He didn't ask for a deposit. He just asked for the first month in cash and told me not to put anything heavy on the floor near the radiator. He led me up a narrow, creaky flight of wooden stairs around the back of the building. He unlocked a door that seemed to be made of plywood and stepped aside. "This is it," he grunted. The room was essentially a crawl space that had aspirations of being an apartment. The ceiling was slanted so sharply that I could only stand up fully in the very center of the room. The walls were a shade of yellow that reminded me of old nicotine stains. There was a single window that looked out onto a brick wall, and a tiny bathroom that was really just a toilet and a sink with a shower head attached to the faucet. But the most overwhelming thing was the smell. The air was thick, humid, and smelled aggressively of floral detergent and hot, wet cotton. Beneath my feet, the floor vibrated with a low, rhythmic hum. Thump, thump, whirr. It was the sound of 20 industrial washing machines spinning downstairs. "I'll take it," I said. I moved in that night. Moving in was a generous term. I had 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of books, and my laptop. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor because I had sold my mattress on the way over. The next week was a blur of aggressive liquidation. I realized quickly that Jasmine of Willow Ridge could not survive in the attic of Suds and Duds. Jasmine of Willow Ridge owned things that required maintenance and care. I needed cash. I went to a resale shop in the trendy part of town with a trunk full of my past. I sold the designer handbags my mother had given me for Christmases, gifts that were really just props for her holiday photos. I sold the stiff, pastel blazers she insisted I wear to networking events. I sold the pearl earrings. I sold the high heels that pinched my toes. The clerk, a girl with purple hair and a nose ring, looked at the pile of luxury goods and then at my frantic expression. "Bad breakup?" she asked as she tallied up the total. "You could say that," I replied. I walked out with $900 in cash. I felt lighter. I was literally selling the expectations my parents had placed on my body. I kept only the essentials: jeans, t-shirts, my durable sneakers, and my winter coat. I bought a cheap foam mattress from a discount store and dragged it up the stairs myself, sweating and cursing as it wedged in the narrow doorway. I bought a folding table from a thrift store for $12. It had a cigarette burn on the plastic top, but it was sturdy. That was my furniture, a mattress on the floor and a burnt table. Then began the hustle. I needed to eat, and $800 would not last long. I couldn't get a real corporate job because I was still delusional enough to think I could salvage my college semester if a miracle happened, so I needed flexibility. I became a creature of the gig economy. By day, I sat at my folding table, the floor vibrating beneath me from the spin cycles downstairs, doing data entry for a medical billing company. It was mind-numbing work, typing codes for colonoscopies and root canals into endless spreadsheets for $10 an hour. By night, I worked the graveyard shift at a diner 3 blocks away called the Biscuit Barn. It was the kind of place where the menu was laminated and sticky, and the customers were mostly truckers, insomniacs, and cops. I learned to balance 4 plates on one arm. I learned that if you poured the coffee fast enough, people didn't notice you were dead on your feet. In the gaps between, I tutored. I posted flyers at the local library offering math help. I ended up teaching algebra to a teenager named Marcus, whose mom paid me in cash and tamales. My life shrank. It became a cycle of work, sleep, humidity, and the smell of Tide. The first Sunday in the attic was the hardest. Sunday was usually family dinner at the Jones house. It was a mandatory performance where we sat around the mahogany table, ate food prepared by a caterer, and listened to Lydia critique our life choices while Gregory checked his stocks. I sat on my mattress, eating a peanut butter sandwich. The room was hot. The dryer vents downstairs were pumping heat right up through the floorboards. I waited for the sadness to hit me. I waited to miss the prime rib and the expensive wine. I waited to miss the feeling of safety. But the sadness didn't come. Instead, I took a bite of my sandwich and looked around my yellow, vibrating box. Nobody was asking me why I hadn't lost those 5 pounds yet. Nobody was comparing my salary to Brooke's husband's imaginary investments. Nobody was telling me to smile more. I was poor. I was exhausted. My back hurt from the cheap mattress, but the air in the room, thick with detergent fumes, belonged to me. The silence on my phone was mine. I wasn't a resource anymore. I was a person, a tired, sweaty, broke person, but a person nonetheless. One night, about 3 weeks in, I came home from the diner at 4 a.m. I smelled like grease and maple syrup. The laundromat downstairs was quiet for once, just the low hum of the vending machine. I climbed the stairs and collapsed onto the floor beside my folding table. I was too tired to shower. I pulled my laptop toward me. The screen glowed in the darkness. I opened my email. There, buried under spam and bill notifications, was a reminder from Midwest Community College in Tulsa. It was a late deadline scholarship opportunity. I had flagged it months ago as a backup plan, a safety school I never thought I would need. Essay prompt: describe a significant challenge you have faced and how it has shaped your perspective on financial responsibility. I laughed, a dry, rasping sound in the empty room. Financial responsibility. I looked at the cursor blinking on the blank white page. I could write the standard essay. I could write the one I had been trained to write at my private high school, the one about hard work and bootstraps and vague, noble struggles that resolved neatly in 500 words. But I was too tired for fiction, and I was too angry for politeness. I grabbed a cardboard box that I had used to move my books. I flipped it over and set it on top of my folding table to raise the laptop to eye level, a makeshift standing desk for the destitute. I cracked my knuckles. They had stolen my tuition. They had stolen my safety. They had stolen my trust. But there was one asset they had forgotten to seize. They had forgotten that I was the one who kept the receipts. I was the one who remembered everything. I began to type. I didn't try to sound academic. I didn't try to sound like the good daughter from Willow Ridge. I wrote about the smell of the laundromat. I wrote about the bank account hitting zero. I wrote about the key hitting the marble table. I wrote about the specific, hollow feeling of realizing you are just an investment vehicle for people who claim to love you. The words poured out of me, fast and ugly and real. I wrote until the sun came up and the washing machines downstairs roared back to life, shaking the floor, shaking the table, shaking the entire world. I hit send. I closed the laptop, curled up on the mattress, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of falling. The email from Midwest Community College arrived 3 weeks after I submitted my essay. I remember staring at the screen in the dim light of the laundromat attic, the floor vibrating beneath me as the spin cycle kicked into high gear downstairs. I expected a rejection. I expected a polite form letter telling me that while my story was tragic, their funds were allocated to students with more traditional profiles. Instead, I got an acceptance. The committee had read my raw, angry, unpolished account of financial betrayal, and they hadn't turned away. They offered me a partial scholarship. It was not a full ride. It covered about 60% of the tuition for an associate degree program, but it was enough. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark water where I had been treading. It allowed me to enroll in a hybrid schedule, taking online classes at night and driving to the Tulsa campus twice a week for the labs I could not do remotely. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I celebrated by buying a secondhand textbook and paying my rent on time. To bridge the gap between the scholarship and the remaining tuition, I took a work-study position at the college's financial aid office. It was the least glamorous job on campus. I spent my afternoons sitting behind a plexiglass barrier, filing loan applications and explaining interest rates to 18-year-olds who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. But that job became my real education. In Willow Ridge, I had thought my situation was unique. I thought I was the only daughter whose parents viewed her as a piggy bank. I carried a lot of shame about it, thinking there must be something wrong with me that made my parents love money more than they loved my future. But as I sat behind that desk, processing file after file, the shame began to evaporate, replaced by a horrifying realization. I was not an anomaly, I was a statistic. I saw it in the eyes of the sophomore girl who came in crying because her credit score was ruined before she could legally buy a drink. Her mother had opened 3 utility accounts in her name and defaulted on all of them. I saw it in the freshman boy who discovered that his federal student loan disbursement had been deposited into a joint account his father controlled, and the money was already gone, spent on a new truck for the family business. I saw parents guilt-tripping their children into taking out the maximum loan amounts, not for books or housing, but to send a little extra help back home. It was a pattern. It was a systemic predation where the older generation, squeezed by their own failures or greed, was cannibalizing the financial futures of their children. They called it family duty. They called it gratitude. But from where I sat, it looked like theft. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late August, just days before the fall semester fully kicked into gear. I was closing up the office when a student named Leo walked in. He was dragging a duffel bag that looked heavy, and his eyes were red-rimmed. Leo was a brilliant engineering major, the kind of kid who actually read the terms and conditions. He sat down and told me he was withdrawing. I asked him why. He told me his parents had refused to co-sign his lease for an off-campus apartment unless he signed over 20% of his loan refund to them. When he refused, they kicked him out of their house and called the landlord to rescind their guarantor status. He had the money for rent from his part-time job, but without a co-signer or a massive security deposit, no landlord would touch him. He was effectively homeless. I looked at Leo, and I saw myself standing in the marble foyer of my parents' house, the key hitting the table. "I cannot let you withdraw," I told him. I closed the office door, which was technically against protocol. I pulled up a list of local landlords on my computer, but I knew most of them. They were corporate-managed complexes that required 3 times the rent and monthly income and a credit score of 700. They were built for students with parents like Gregory and Lydia, parents who paid. They were not built for students like Leo or me. That night, back in the attic, I couldn't sleep. The smell of detergent felt suffocating. I paced the small strip of floor between my mattress and the window. The system was broken. The entire rental market was designed around the assumption that a student had a safety net. It assumed that if you fell, a parent would catch you. But for people like us, the parent was the one pushing. We didn't need a safety net. We needed a different kind of key. I sat down at my wobbly folding table and opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the page, I wrote 2 words: dorm key. It was literal, but it was also symbolic. The key to your room, the key to your life, the key that you held, not your father, not your mother. I spent the next 3 nights in a fever state. I went to the library and checked out every book I could find on tenant rights, subleasing laws, and property management. I realized there was a gap in the market. There were plenty of small-time landlords, older couples with a spare room, owners of garage apartments, people with duplexes, who didn't care about credit scores or co-signers. They just wanted a tenant who was quiet and paid on time. But these landlords weren't on the big corporate listing sites. They were invisible. And there were hundreds of students who were desperate, responsible, and cash-ready, but credit invisible or estranged from their guarantors. I needed to build a bridge between them. I was an accounting major, not a computer scientist. I could build a spreadsheet that would make a CPA weep with joy, but I couldn't code a website. I approached Jalen, a guy in my Intro to Business class. Jalen was the quiet type who wore hoodies in the summer and typed faster than he spoke. I had seen him building a fan site for an obscure anime during a lecture, so I knew he had the skills. I cornered him after class and pitched him the idea. I didn't use buzzwords. I didn't talk about disrupting the market. I just told him about Leo. I told him about my tuition. I told him, I want to build a platform where your background check is your GPA and your work history, not your parents' credit score. Jalen stared at me for a long moment. Then he pulled up his sleeve to reveal a faded scar on his forearm. My dad took a credit card out in my name when I was 16. He said quietly, I found out when I tried to buy a phone. I'm in. We worked out of my attic. It was hot. It was loud. And it smelled like fabric softener. But it became our headquarters. Jalen sat on the floor with his back against the wall, coding on a laptop that was held together with duct tape. I sat at the folding table, calling every small landlord I could find in the classified ads, pitching them on a new kind of tenant verification system. We built a database. It was crude. It was ugly. The interface looked like something from the late 90s, but it worked. We called it Dorm Key. We launched the beta version, which was really just a glorified shared document with a search bar, 48 hours before the start of the semester. The test case was a group of 4 students I had met through the financial aid office, including Leo. They were all in the same boat. Verified income, good grades, but rejected by every major apartment complex because of credit issues or lack of guarantors. I found a landlord named Mrs. Higgins. She owned a 4-bedroom house near the campus that she usually rented to visiting professors. She was tired of empty vacancies and hated corporate property managers. I met her for coffee. I showed her the profiles of the 4 students. I showed her their transcripts. I showed her their pay stubs. I looked her in the eye and said, These kids are not risky. They are the most determined people you will ever meet because they have nowhere else to go. If you give them a chance, they will treat your house like a sanctuary. Mrs. Higgins hesitated. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at me. I like your eyes, she said. You look like you have been through a war. She gave us the keys. I ran back to the attic. Jalen was asleep on his keyboard. I shook him awake. We got the house, I said. We called the students. They met us at the property an hour later. It was a simple brick house with a fenced yard. To them, it looked like a palace. When I handed the key to Leo, his hands were shaking. He didn't say anything. He just held the metal piece tight against his palm, closing his eyes as if he were afraid it would vanish. Another girl, a nursing student named Sarah, started crying. She sat down on the front steps and just wept, the tension of months of uncertainty finally breaking. I stood on the sidewalk, watching them unlock the door. I watched them walk into a space that was legally theirs. No parents could enter. No parents could threaten to stop paying rent if they didn't change their major or break up with a boyfriend. It was just a rental house, but in that moment, I realized it was something else entirely. For the first time since the night my bank account hit 0, the cold knot in my chest loosened. I looked at Jalen, who was smiling a tired, crooked smile. I had thought my goal was just to get my degree. I thought the finish line was walking across a stage and proving to Gregory and Lydia that I could succeed without them. But as I watched Leo open a window and let the fresh air in, I realized my ambition had shifted. Revenge was a small, petty fuel. It burned hot, but it burned out. This was different. I wasn't just going to survive the system that my parents represented. I was going to build a shelter for everyone they had tried to crush. I was going to become the architect of a new kind of family, one where the currency was trust and the doors locked from the inside. I turned to Jalen. We need more houses, I said. He nodded, cracking his knuckles. Then we better get back to the attic. It started with a girl named Chloe and a 60-second video clip. Chloe was a freshman who had been living in her hatchback for 3 days because her stepfather refused to sign a lease unless she changed her major from art history to business. We had matched her with a retired librarian in Tulsa who had a spare room above her garage and a soft spot for painters. Chloe posted the video on TikTok at 2 a.m. It was raw. She was sitting on the floor of her new room, crying, holding the key we had given her. The caption was simple. My family wanted to control me with money. Dorm Key gave me a way out. By the time I woke up for my shift at the medical billing office, the video had 2 million views. Jalen called me, his voice cracking with panic. "The server is melting," he screamed. "We have 4,000 hits in the last 10 minutes. The site looks like a potato. Jasmine, it is going to crash." I ran back to the attic. The laptop on my folding table was hot to the touch. The inbox, which usually held 2 or 3 inquiries a day, was refreshing so fast it looked like a slot machine. Ding! 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 "I need a room. My mom took my loan money. Can you help me in Ohio? Can you help me in Florida?" It wasn't just a local problem. It was a national epidemic. We had accidentally tapped into a vein of hidden trauma that ran through the entire American university system. For the next 10 days, I did not sleep. I stopped going to the diner. I barely did my homework. My life became a triage unit. Jalen and I sat on the floor of the attic, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and takeout boxes, trying to keep the ship afloat. We were manually verifying landlords, cross-checking student IDs, and replying to desperate emails with trembling fingers. It was exhausting, it was terrifying, and it was the most exhilarating feeling I had ever known. The momentum caught the attention of the Tulsa Student Advocacy Group, a local nonprofit. They invited me to speak at their monthly mixer. I showed up wearing my jeans and a clean white t-shirt, standing in a room full of people in business casual. That was where I met Reese. Reese was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a handshake that felt like a contract. He wasn't a shark like the men my father played golf with. He was a philanthropic angel investor who specialized in what he called systemic repair. He sat me down in a corner booth and listened while I explained the chaos of the last week. I told him about the spreadsheet database. I told him about the landlords we were vetting by phone. I told him about the attic that smelled like Tide. He didn't laugh. He leaned forward. "You are building a shadow housing market for the economically abused," he said. "It is brilliant, but you cannot run this on a folding table." He offered me a seed grant. It was $25,000. To my father, $25,000 was a bad weekend in Vegas. To me, it was an empire. "I want you to form a proper entity," Reese said. "Hire Jalen. Hire 2 more students to help with vetting. Build a real website." 2 weeks later, I drove to Oklahoma City. I walked into a glass-walled office building downtown to sign the incorporation papers. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This environment, the cold air conditioning, the hushed elevator, the smell of expensive carpet, was my parents' natural habitat. For a moment, I felt a phantom weight, the old imposter syndrome creeping in. Who was I to be here? I was just the girl who got robbed. But then I sat at the conference table. The lawyer slid a stack of papers toward me. "Dorm Key Collective, LLC." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. When I signed my name, Jasmine Jones, Managing Director, it felt different than any signature I had ever made. It wasn't a permission slip. It wasn't a dependency. It was a declaration. I walked out of that building and drove straight to a department store. I needed armor. I found a charcoal gray suit on the clearance rack for $40. The fabric was synthetic. Not the Italian wool my mother used to drape me in, but the cut was sharp. I bought a white blouse and a pair of sensible black heels. Back in the attic, I put it on. I stood in front of the small, warped mirror leaned against the wall. The girl looking back at me wasn't the daughter who had been left behind. She wasn't the victim who had begged for an explanation in the foyer of the Willow Ridge mansion. She was a woman who had taken a pile of bricks thrown at her head and started building a fortress. I looked professional. I looked dangerous. The local newspaper, the Tulsa Gazette, picked up the story a few days later. A journalist had seen Chloe's TikTok and tracked me down. She interviewed me for 2 hours at a coffee shop. I didn't hold back. I didn't name Gregory and Lydia explicitly, but I told the story of the tuition theft. I framed it as the origin story of the company. The headline ran on Sunday morning, "Left Behind. The student whose parents took her tuition is now building a housing network for the financial orphans of the middle class." I stared at the paper. The words were black and stark. It was out there. By noon, The article had been shared 3,000 times on social media. My phone blew up with notifications from people tagging me, praising the initiative. But amidst the pride, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Willow Ridge read the Gazette. My parents' friends read the Gazette. I imagined them sitting in their sunroom, unfolding the paper. I imagined the color draining from Lydia's face. I imagined Gregory choking on his espresso. They would see the photo of me, standing in front of the laundromat, arms crossed, looking defiant. They would realize that their family secret, the way they had cannibalized my future to fund their image, was now the foundation of my success. I hadn't just survived their betrayal. I had monetized it. I had turned their greed into my marketing strategy. Part of me was terrified. I was poking the bear. But a bigger part of me felt a savage satisfaction. They had tried to erase me. Now, I was making headlines. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the attic in shades of orange and dust, my laptop pinged with a new email. It wasn't a landlord. It wasn't a student in crisis. The subject line read, "Scholarship Proposal, Brookfield State University." I froze. Brookfield State was a prestigious 4-year university in a neighboring state. It was the kind of school I had dreamed of attending before my savings vanished, the kind of school that was out of my league financially. I opened the email. Dear Ms. Jones, we have been following the development of Dorm Key and read the recent profile in the Gazette with great interest. Your ability to identify a systemic gap in student housing and mobilize a solution with limited resources is extraordinary. At Brookfield, we value innovation and resilience over standardized test scores. We would like to offer you the Chancellor's Impact Scholarship. This covers full tuition, room, and board for the remainder of your undergraduate degree, provided you bring the headquarters of Dorm Key to our campus innovation hub. I stopped breathing. Full tuition, room, board. The words swam before my eyes. I read the final paragraph. We believe that family is often defined by those who show up when things get hard. We want to be the family that supports your next chapter. We trust you will change the way people think about the words family support. I leaned back in my cheap plastic chair, the one with the cigarette burn. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden. My parents had stolen $60,000 and told me I was on my own. And because of that, because I had refused to die in the dark, a stranger was offering me a future worth double that amount. I looked at the gray suit hanging on the back of the door. I looked at the humming server Jalen had set up in the corner. I hit reply. I wasn't just going to college. I was going to war. And for the first time, I had a war chest. The transition to Brookfield State was supposed to be a victory lap. I had the scholarship, the startup, and the gray suit that made me feel invincible. But 3 days before I was scheduled to move my few boxes of possessions to the new campus, I sat in the office of Mr. Alvarez, the university's senior financial aid counselor. The office smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. Mr. Alvarez was a man who looked like he had seen every possible way a student could ruin their life. But today, he looked specifically pale. He had offered to run a standard credit check for me, a formality to clear me for an apartment in the honors housing block. He turned the monitor away from me. Jasmine, he said, his voice dropping an octave, we have a problem with your file. I felt a familiar coldness prickle at the back of my neck. What kind of problem? I asked. My tuition is covered. The scholarship letter was clear. It is not the scholarship, he said. It is the background check. The Housing Committee flags any applicant with a debt-to-income ratio above 60% or active collections. I laughed. It was a nervous, jagged sound. Mr. Alvarez, I said, I own a debit card with $4,000 on it. I have a checking account. I do not have a credit card. I do not have loans. My debt ratio is 0. He did not smile. He tapped a key on his keyboard and the printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out pages with a rhythmic, damning thwack, thwack, thwack. He waited until the stack was thick before he handed it to me. It was a consumer credit report. At the top, in bold red letters, was a score that made my stomach drop. 420. I scanned the rows of data. my eyes blurred, trying to make sense of the impossibility before me. Store card. Neiman Marcus. Balance, $8,400. Status, 120 days past due. Personal loan. Sunbelt Rapid Cash. Balance, $15,000. Status, in collections. Credit line. American Express Platinum. Balance, $22,000. Status, charge-off pending. I looked up at him. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves. "This is not mine," I whispered. "I have never walked into a Neiman Marcus in my life. I shop at thrift stores. I eat peanut butter." "Mr. Alvarez nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I have seen your bank statements. You live like a monk, but the system does not know that. The system sees a social security number and a matching address." I looked closer at the report. The address listed for every single account was the Willow Ridge Mansion. The dates of opening ranged from 6 months ago to just 3 weeks ago. My parents had not just stolen my savings, they had stolen my name. "Can we see the applications?" I asked. I felt sick, a physical nausea rising in my throat. Mr. Alvarez made a few phone calls. He had contacts at the credit bureaus, people he usually called to help students fix simple errors. This was not a simple error. Within an hour, a fax machine in the back room groaned and produced a copy of the authorization form for the personal loan. He placed it on the desk between us. It was a document granting power of attorney for financial decisions, dated to my 18th birthday, and at the bottom was a signature, Jasmine Jones. I stared at the ink. It was my name, but the loop of the J was too wide. The slant was too aggressive. It was my mother's handwriting trying desperately to look like mine. It was a forgery, but it was a good one. It was practiced. They had been planning this, or if not planning it, they had kept this weapon in their back pocket, a glass to break in case of emergency. I realized then what had happened. The wedding in Santorini, the liquidity crunch Gregory had mentioned, the failed real estate deal in Tulum. They had burned through their own credit. They had burned through Brooke's husband's money. And when the walls started closing in, when the banks stopped lending to Gregory and Lydia Jones, they didn't stop spending. They just switched hosts. They looked at me, their daughter, the one they called the smart one, and saw a pristine credit score that wasn't being used. To them, it must have felt like finding a spare room in a burning house. Why let it go to waste? Mr. Alvarez watched me process this. He didn't offer me a tissue. He offered me something better. "This is fraud. Jasmine," he said, "this is a felony." He wrote a name on a sticky note. Celia Grant. "She is a lawyer who works with the University Pro Bono Clinic," he explained. "She specializes in identity theft and familial financial abuse. I already called her. She is waiting for you in Building 4. I walked across the campus in a daze. The sun was shining. Students were throwing frisbees on the lawn, but the world looked gray to me. I felt dirty. I felt violated in a way that was deeper than the empty bank account. Money is a resource. You can earn it back. But credit? Identity? That is your reputation in the eyes of the world. They had taken my good name and dragged it through the mud of their own incompetence. Celia Grant was a sharp woman with short hair and a desk organized with military precision. She did not waste time with sympathy. She treated my life like a crime scene that needed to be secured. She laid out the options. "Option 1, she said, you pay the debt. You accept the liability. You spend the next 10 years digging out of a $50,000 hole you didn't dig." I shook my head. "No." "Option 2, she continued, you file a police report for identity theft. You sign an affidavit stating that these signatures are forgeries. You authorize the banks to prosecute the individuals who committed the fraud." She looked me in the eye. "That means your parents. Jasmine, once you pull this trigger, the bullet doesn't stop. The banks will go after them. The police might go after them. This isn't a family dispute anymore. It is the state versus Gregory and Lydia Jones." I sat in the silence of her office. I thought about the gala dinners they hosted. I thought about the way my mother would adjust my collar before church so we looked perfect. I thought about the lie of the happy family they had constructed so carefully, brick by expensive brick. If I signed that paper, I was dropping a bomb on that house. But then I looked at the faxed copy of the loan application again. I looked at the date. It was signed 2 days after I had confronted them in the living room. 2 days after I dropped my key on the table. They knew I was homeless. They knew I was living in an attic. They knew I had nothing. And yet, 48 hours after I walked out, they walked into a loan office, impersonated me, and took out $15,000. They didn't just not care if I survived. They were actively eating me alive to keep themselves warm. A strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. It was the cold, hard realization that the people I called parents were not powerful titans of industry. They were drowning. People with money don't commit felony identity fraud against their children. People with options don't forge signatures for consumer loans. My parents were broke. They were destitute. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they were trying to use my body as a bridge to get to safety. If I let them get away with this, they would not stop. They would open another card next month, then a mortgage, then a business line of credit. They would drain me until I was as hollow as they were. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy in my hand. I am not doing this to hurt them, I said, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. Celia raised an eyebrow. Then why? I am doing this to build a wall, I said. If I cut off this supply, they have nowhere left to go. They have to face their own mess. I looked at the affidavit. I, Jasmine Jones, declare under penalty of perjury that I did not authorize. I had an idea. It was dark, and it was sharp. If I filed this, the credit bureaus would lock my file. My social security number would become a fortress. My parents would reach into their pocket for their spare key, me, and find the lock changed. And when they realized they couldn't steal from me anymore, when the creditors came knocking at the glass door of the Willow Ridge house, they would have no choice. They would fall. And when they fell, who would be the only person left standing? Who would be the only person in the family with a clean name, a legitimate business, and a future? Me. By signing this paper, I wasn't just defending myself. I was setting a trap. I was forcing them to come to me, eventually, not as parents demanding obedience, but as bankrupts begging for mercy. I signed my name. The ink was black and permanent. Celia took the paper and nodded. I will file this within the hour, she said. By tomorrow morning, every account will be frozen. The fraud investigation units at the banks will open files on Gregory and Lydia. Thank you, I said. I stood up and walked out of the office. My hands were trembling slightly, a physiological reaction to the adrenaline, but my mind was quiet. I walked to the nearest trash can and threw away the copy of the credit report with the 420 score. I looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Let the storm come, I thought. I just poured the concrete for my foundation, and this time, nobody has the key but me. The chandeliers in the Great Hall of Brookfield State were not made of glass. They were crystal, heavy and refractive, casting a kaleidoscope of light over 300 donors, alumni, and scholarship recipients. The air smelled of expensive catering, truffle oil, searing steak, and the specific metallic scent of old money. It had been 1 year since I sat in the attic of the laundromat, eating a peanut butter sandwich on a mattress that smelled of detergent. Tonight, I was wearing a navy blue silk dress that I had bought with my own salary, not a stipend from my parents, not a loan. Salary. Dorm Key was no longer just a spreadsheet run by 2 students on the floor. It was a platform operating in 6 states, with 12 employees and a partnership agreement with the University Housing Board. I stood backstage, adjusting the microphone pack clipped to my waist. My heart was beating a steady, confident rhythm. In 10 minutes, I was scheduled to give the keynote speech on innovation in crisis. Jasmine? The voice came from the shadows near the loading dock entrance. It was a voice I had not heard in 12 months, except in the nightmares I was slowly learning to forget. I turned around. Standing by a stack of folded chairs were Gregory and Lydia Jones. For a second, my brain tried to superimpose the image of the parents I remembered, the titans of Willow Ridge, polished to a shine, radiating invulnerability, but the image refused to stick. The people standing before me were ghosts of their former selves. Gregory was wearing his tuxedo, but it looked tired. The lapels were slightly frayed, and the shirt was not the crisp, starch-stiff armor he used to wear. It was wrinkled. He looked thinner, his skin hanging loosely around his jawline, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if he expected a process server to jump out from behind a curtain. Lydia was worse. She was wearing a gown I recognized from 3 seasons ago. One she used to complain was too matronly. Her hair, usually a helmet of perfect blonde highlights, was showing gray at the roots. Her makeup was applied a little too heavily, trying to cover the dark circles that looked like bruises under her eyes. They didn't look like the villains of my story. They looked like the wreckage left behind after the storm. "Mom? Dad?" I asked, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Oh, Jasmine!" Lydia rushed forward, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. She reached out as if to hug me, but I took a sharp step back. She froze, her hands hovering in the empty air. "We are so proud of you," she said, her voice pitching up into that fake, bright tone she used for dinner parties. "We saw the article in the state paper, the big spread. My goodness, our little girl, a CEO. We just had to come and see you." I looked at the security guard standing 10 feet away. He was looking at his phone. They must have slipped in through the caterer's entrance. "You were not invited," I said. My voice was cool, detached. It was the voice I used for negotiating vendor contracts. "Don't be like that, sweetheart," Gregory said, stepping up beside Lydia. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "We are your parents. We wanted to share in your moment." I crossed my arms. "Why are you really here?" Gregory's smile faltered. He exchanged a look with Lydia, a look of desperate, silent communication that I had seen 1,000 times before. It was the look of 2 people coordinating a lie. "Well," Gregory started, clearing his throat, "since you are doing so well, and we are truly thrilled about that, really, we thought it might be a good time to discuss a small, family matter. Here it comes," I thought. "We are in a bit of a liquidity bind," Gregory said, using his favorite euphemism for being broke. "The market has been cruel to the real estate sector, and with the legal misunderstanding regarding the identity issues last year, the banks have been difficult." Legal misunderstanding, that was what he called the felony fraud of forging my signature. "We need to refinance the house," Lydia blurted out. Unable to hold back, "The bank is threatening foreclosure. Jasmine, they want to take the house, your childhood home." I stared at them. They stood there, in their fading finery, asking me to save the very glass fortress they had thrown me out of. "And?" I asked. "We need a co-signer," Gregory said. "Just for the restructuring. We don't need your money. We just need your credit profile, with your new standing, your business assets. If you sign as a guarantor, the bank will back off. We can save the house." I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had sat in that kitchen, drinking espresso, telling me my tuition was a contribution to family happiness. "You want me to co-sign a loan?" I asked, letting the incredulity seep into my voice. "After you stole $60,000 from me? After you forged my name on credit cards? After you left me to sleep in an attic?" "That was in the past," Lydia cried, her voice rising. "Why must you hold on to grudges? We are talking about survival. Jasmine, if we lose the house, where will we go? We cannot live in an apartment. We are the Joneses." "You can live in an apartment," I said. "I did. It builds character." Gregory's face darkened. The pleading mask slipped, revealing the bully underneath. "You owe us." "Jasmine," he hissed, stepping closer. "We raised you. We fed you. You are standing here in a silk dress because we gave you the genes to be smart. You cannot just let us sink." "I owe you nothing," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was hard as steel. I paid my debt the night I walked out. I paid it with my tuition. I paid it with my silence. I am not signing anything. I continued. I am not giving you a cent. I am not giving you my name. That house is a monument to a life you could not afford. Let it fall. Gregory's eyes narrowed. He looked ugly then, desperate and mean. If you don't help us, he said, lowering his voice to a growl, I will go to that reporter, the one who wrote the puff piece about you. I will tell him the truth. And what truth is that? I asked. I will tell him that Dorm Key was built with family money. Gregory said, I will tell him you stole the seed capital from us before you ran away. I will paint you as a liar and a thief. Who will they believe? The respected developer from Willow Ridge or the runaway daughter? I almost laughed. It was such a pathetic, outdated threat. He still thought he was the respected developer. He didn't realize he was already a ghost. Go ahead, I said. Gregory blinked. What? Call the reporter, I said. Call him right now. Because I have a folder in my office. In that folder is a police report filed by Celia Grant. In that folder are the affidavits from the bank confirming that you committed identity theft. In that folder is the paper trail of every dollar I earned, starting with the tips from the diner and the grant from the nonprofit. I took a step toward him. He shrank back. I didn't press charges last year because I wanted to move on. I said, but if you try to tarnish my name one more time, I will not just defend myself. I will hand that file to the district attorney. And you won't be looking for an apartment, Dad. You will be looking for a cellmate. Gregory's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Lydia. She was trembling, her hands clutching her fake pearl necklace. You wouldn't, Lydia whispered. We are your parents. You ceased to be my parents the moment you looked at me and saw a credit line instead of a human being. I said. The silence that stretched between us was heavy and final. Excuse me, Ms. Jones? A campus security officer stepped out of the shadows. He looked at me, then at the two disheveled people cornering me against the wall. Is everything all right here? Are these people bothering you? I looked at them one last time. I looked at the sweat on my father's forehead. I looked at the terror in my mother's eyes. I felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, like watching a sad movie through a thick pane of glass. Yes, I said calmly. They are bothering me. They are uninvited guests. Please show them the exit. Jasmine, Lydia screamed, the veneer of sanity finally cracking. You can't do this. We gave you life. The security officer stepped between us, his broad back blocking them from my view. Sir, ma'am, you need to leave, now. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the curtain, toward the light of the stage. Behind me, I could hear the scuffle of resistance, the sound of my mother sobbing, the sound of my father shouting impotent threats that faded as they were dragged toward the door. Jasmine, please, the house! The sounds receded down the hallway, growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the heavy velvet drapes. I stood in the wings. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. The master of ceremonies walked to the podium. His voice boomed through the speakers, magnified and clear, drowning out the last echoes of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, tonight we celebrate resilience. We celebrate the power of turning adversity into action. Please welcome a student who transformed her own financial tragedy into a national solution. I smoothed the front of my dress. The CEO of Dorm Key, he announced, Jasmine Jones. The applause was thunderous. It washed over me like a wave, warm and validating. I walked out into the light. I didn't look back at the dark hallway where my parents were being escorted out into the rain. I looked forward, at the sea of faces, at the donors, at the students. I walked to the center of the stage, gripped the podium, and began to speak. And for the first time, my voice didn't belong to the daughter of Gregory and Lydia. It belonged only to me. The air conditioning in the private holding room at Brookfield State Stadium was set to 68 degrees, a sharp, artificial chill that contrasted with the humid September heat pressing against the windows. Outside, 20,000 people were finding their seats on the bleachers. I could hear them through the concrete walls, a low, thrumming vibration of excitement and anticipation. It was convocation day, the first day of the academic year. In another life, a life where my parents had been different people, I would have been one of the faces in that crowd 4 years ago. I would have been 18, wearing a generic university t-shirt, sweating in the sun, worried about finding my dorm room and making friends. I would have been innocent. But that timeline had been severed the night the bank notification lit up my phone. Now, I was 23. I was not sitting in the bleachers. I was standing in the VIP green room, wearing a tailored cream blazer, checking my notes for the keynote address. I was a student, yes, finally finishing the degree I had fought for, but I was also a case study. I was the founder of Dorm Key. I was the girl who had turned financial abandonment into a business model. I took a sip of water. My hands were steady. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I looked ready. Then, my phone buzzed on the glass coffee table. It was a single, aggressive vibration. I looked down. The screen showed a number I had deleted but never forgotten. It was a local area code from Willow Ridge. I stared at it. For a moment, the old fear spiked. A reflex, like flinching when you expect a blow. But it passed quickly, replaced by a cold curiosity. They knew today was the big day. The university had promoted the event on social media. They knew exactly where I was. I picked up the phone and swiped right. I did not say hello. I just held the device to my ear and waited. Jasmine? The voice was unrecognizable at first. It was high, thin, and cracked, stripped of all its usual polish and arrogance. It took me a second to place it. Brooke. My sister, the princess of the Savannah Coastal Wedding Fund, the girl whose desire for a second ceremony in Santorini had cost me my education. What do you want? Brooke, I asked. My voice was calm, the voice of a stranger. Jasmine, you have to help us. It is all gone. It is all crashing down. She sounded like she was hyperventilating. I could hear background noise, the sound of things being moved, maybe boxes being taped, or perhaps just the static of a bad connection. Slow down, I said. What is gone? The Florida project, she sobbed. The eco-resort, Colton. Colton messed up the permits. The investors pulled out last week. We declared bankruptcy this morning. Jasmine, Chapter 7. We lost everything. I listened, feeling absolutely nothing. No joy, no sorrow. Just the dry acknowledgement of a math equation finally balancing out. Okay, I said. That sounds like a problem for Colton. Why are you calling me? Because they are taking the house, she screamed, her voice distorting the speaker. Mom and Dad put the house up as collateral for the bridge loan to save the resort. The bank served the foreclosure notice yesterday. They gave us 30 days. Jasmine, 30 days. I walked over to the window and looked out at the stadium. The marching band was taking the field, a sea of red and gold uniforms. 30 days is a standard eviction window. I said, you should start packing. How can you be so cold? She shrieked. Do you know where we have to go? We can't afford anything in Willow Ridge. Dad is looking at apartments in the industrial district, near the airport. Jasmine, it is a 2-bedroom unit next to a highway. Mom hasn't stopped crying for 24 hours. I looked at the notes for my speech. Slide 3. Resilience is not just bouncing back. It is rebuilding the floor. I am sure it will be an adjustment, I said, but people live near the airport every day. Brooke, it is not a tragedy. It is just life. You did this. The accusation came out of nowhere, sharp and venomous. Excuse me? I asked. You did this to us, she yelled. That article you let them write, the police report about the identity theft, you told everyone our business. You ruined Dad's reputation. No private lenders would touch him after the news got out that he forged his daughter's signature. You poisoned the well. Jasmine, you made us radioactive. I gripped the phone tighter. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, standing in the rubble of their own greed, they were looking for a scapegoat. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice dropping lower. You think I ruined the family because I stopped letting you steal from me? "You humiliated us," she cried. "You could have kept it private. You could have just paid the debt and kept your mouth shut. But you had to be the victim. You had to play the martyr. And now Mom and Dad are losing their home because of your ego." I closed my eyes. I remembered the night I found the transfer. I remembered the Instagram story of her holding the wedding invitation, laughing in the sun. "Brooke," I said, "I want you to answer one question for me." She was sniffling on the other end. "What?" "The night Mom and Dad drained my tuition account to pay for your wedding in Greece," I said, "the night they took 4 years of my hard work and turned it into a party. Did you, for one single second, stop and ask where that money came from?" Silence. "Did you ask?" I repeated. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought they just had it." "You didn't ask," I said. "You didn't care. You were so used to consuming everything around you that you never stopped to look at the price tag. You didn't care if I had a future. You didn't care if I had a degree. As long as you had your champagne and your photos, I didn't exist." "That is not fair," she wept. "I am your sister." "No," I said. "You are a parasite, and the host has finally died." "Jasmine, please," she begged, her voice breaking into a jagged sob. "I am scared. I don't know how to be poor. I don't know how to live in a place like that. Just, can't you help? You have the company now. You have investors. Just a loan? Or maybe you could buy the house and let us rent it? Anything? Please." I listened to her beg. It was the sound of a child who had never been told no, finally facing the physics of the real world. "I am not a bank, Brooke," I said, "and Dorm Key is not a piggy bank for the Jones family. I have a fiduciary responsibility to my investors, and personally, I have a responsibility to myself never to let you people near my wallet again." "So that is it?" she asked. "You are just going to watch us drown?" "I am not watching you drown," I said. "I am watching you learn how to swim." I looked at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes until showtime. "Here is my advice," I said. "It is the only thing I'm going to give you. Get a good bankruptcy lawyer. Sell the jewelry. Sell the designer bags. Sell the pearl suitcases. You can probably get 3 months of rent out of your wardrobe alone. And then, Brooke, get a job. The diner on Main Street is hiring night shifts. I know. Because that is where I worked when you were drinking wine in Santorini." "You are a monster," she spat. "You are letting your parents lose their home." I paused. The marching band outside struck up the school fight song. The drums were loud, vibrating against the glass. "They let me lose college," I said. "Now we are even." I took the phone away from my ear. I could hear her screaming my name, a tiny, tinny sound coming from the device. I pressed the red button. The call ended. The connection was severed. I stood there for a moment in the silence of the room. I thought I would feel guilty. I thought the old conditioning would kick in. The voice that said I was bad, selfish, ungrateful. But I felt nothing but light. The heavy anchor that had been dragging behind me for years, the obligation, the anger, the need for their validation, had just snapped. They were on their own. They were facing the consequences of a lifetime of choices, and I was free. "Ms. Jones?" The stage manager poked his head through the door. He was wearing a headset and holding a clipboard. "We are ready for you. The dean is starting your introduction." I nodded. "I am ready," I said. I put the phone back on the table. I left it there. I didn't need it. I walked out of the green room and down the concrete tunnel toward the field. The light at the end of the tunnel was blindingly bright, white and pure. The roar of the crowd grew louder with every step. "A student who proves that your background does not dictate your future." I heard the dean's voice booming over the stadium speakers. "Please welcome Jasmine Jones." I stepped out onto the grass. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that hit me in the chest. Thousands of students were clapping, cheering, looking at me. I walked to the podium in the center of the field. I adjusted the microphone. I looked up at the stands, shielding my eyes from the sun. Somewhere, miles away, in a house filled with boxes, my family was falling apart. But here, on this field, I was building something new. I took a breath. "Good morning." "Brookfield," I said. My voice echoed across the stadium, strong and clear. We talk a lot about safety nets, I began, deviating slightly from my prepared script. We talk about family as the foundation of our lives. But what happens when the foundation cracks? What happens when the people who are supposed to shelter you are the storm itself? I paused. The stadium went quiet. That is when you learn the most important lesson of your life, I said. You learn that you can pour your own concrete, you can lay your own bricks, and the house you build for yourself, that is the only one that can never be taken away. I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it reached my eyes. Let's get to work. 2 days after the convocation speech, I sat in a conference room that smelled of lemon polish and billable hours. Celia Grant, the attorney who had helped me freeze my credit a year ago, slid a thick dossier across the mahogany table. Beside her sat Mr. Alvarez, who had transitioned from being my financial aid counselor to an unofficial advisor for the dorm keyboard. The document on top was a foreclosure listing. It is official, Celia said, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail. The bank has seized the property at 104 Willow Ridge Drive. The auction is set for next Tuesday. It is a blind bid process. I looked at the photo of the house. It was a professional real estate shot. Likely taken 5 years ago when the landscaping was perfect and the facade was gleaming white. It looked like a temple. It looked like a fortress. Mr. Alvarez leaned forward. Jasmine, you do not have to do this. We can find another property for the pilot program. There are old hotels downtown, converted warehouses. Buying this specific house carries a lot of emotional liability. He was right. Of course, rationally, buying the house where my parents had systematically devalued me was a terrible idea. It was walking back into the fire. But I wasn't thinking rationally. I was thinking architecturally. If I let a stranger buy it, I said, staring at the white columns, it remains a monument. Someone else with too much money and too little empathy will move in. They will host the same parties. They will ignore their children in the same rooms. The cycle continues. The house wins. I looked up at them. But if we buy it, if we gut it, then we strip it of its power. We turn the symbol of exclusion into a center for inclusion. Celia sighed, but I saw the ghost of a smile on her lips. She opened her laptop. Okay, she said, if we are doing this, we are doing it smart. We are not buying it as dorm key. That would generate too much press before we are ready. We are not buying it as Jasmine Jones. That would give your parents a target. We formed a limited liability company that afternoon. I named it Second Foundation Housing. It was a nod to the idea that if your first foundation, your family, crumbles, you have to pour a second one yourself. We used 20% of Dormkey's retained earnings and a significant grant from the Reese Family Trust. We ran the numbers. The market in Willow Ridge had softened. The house had liens. The reputation of the previous owners, my parents, was toxic, which scared away the superstitious buyers. We submitted a sealed bid. My father had always bragged that the house was worth $3 million. He said it at every dinner party. He said it was his legacy. Our bid was $1,100,000. It was an insult. It was a lowball offer designed for a distressed asset that nobody else wanted to touch. On Tuesday afternoon, Celia called me. We got it, she said. I didn't cheer. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction, like snapping a puzzle piece into place. We own the asset, I said. When do we get the keys? Thursday. On Thursday morning, I didn't drive my old sedan. I drove the company van, a practical white transit vehicle with the Dorm Key logo on the side. I brought Jalen, who was now our chief technology officer, and a team of 3 architecture students from Brookfield State who were interning with us to design affordable housing layouts. We pulled into the driveway. The house looked different. The grass was overgrown. There were oil stains on the limestone where my father's Range Rover used to leak. The windows were dusty. It looked like what it was, a shell. I walked to the front door. The lock had been changed by the bank, but the weight of the door was the same. I inserted the new key. It turned with a smooth, heavy click. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of orchids and coffee anymore. It smelled of stale air and abandonment. The pearl suitcases were gone. The furniture was gone. The marble floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. I stood in the center of the room where I had dropped my key on the table 2 years ago. The table was gone, repossessed or sold. There was just an empty space. "Jasmine?" Jalen asked, stepping in behind me with a tablet in his hand. "You okay?" "I am fine," I said. "I am just measuring." I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the stone. The architecture students were already pulling out tape measures and laser levels, treating the space like a raw canvas. They didn't see the ghosts. They saw square footage. "This living room is huge," one of them said. "We could put partitions here. Create a communal workspace, maybe 4 distinct study pods." "Do it," I said. I walked into the dining room. I looked at the spot where the mahogany table used to be. I remembered the Sunday dinners. I remembered Lydia telling me I looked tired. I remembered Gregory telling me not to bore the guests with my talk about budgeting. "Make this the financial counseling center." I told the student, "Put the desks right here. I want students to sit in this room and learn how to read a credit report. I want them to learn how to open an IRA. I want them to learn the things that protect them from people like the previous owners." We went upstairs. I walked down the hall to my old room. It was smaller than I remembered. The walls were still painted the pale gray my mother had chosen because she said it was neutral. I touched the wall. "This will be a transitional room," I said. 2 beds, soundproof divider, for emergency placements. Students who get kicked out at midnight and have nowhere to go. I walked to the master bedroom. It was massive, with a fireplace and a balcony overlooking the pool. This was the sanctuary of Gregory and Lydia. This was where they plotted their vacations and ignored their debts. "Got it," I said. The students looked at me. "Remove the fireplace," I ordered. "Remove the walk-in closet shelving. This space can accommodate 4 micro-units if we are clever with the layout. This is not a suite for a king and queen anymore. It is a dormitory." As we walked back down the stairs, I noticed something on the banister. It was a small, deep scratch in the wood, right near the curve. I had made that scratch when I was 14, dragging a heavy suitcase down the stairs for a summer camp trip because my parents couldn't be bothered to help me carry it. One of the architects, a bright girl named Maya, followed my gaze. "We can sand that out," she said. "We are going to refinish all the wood anyway. Make it look brand new." "No," I said. I ran my thumb over the scratch. "Leave it," I said. "And in the kitchen, there are pencil marks inside the pantry doorframe where I used to measure my height. Leave those too." "Why?" Maya asked. "Because I don't want this place to look like a sterile institution," I said, "and I don't want to erase the history. I want the students who live here to know that someone survived this house. I want them to see the scars. It proves that you can get out." We spent the next 6 hours mapping the destruction. We planned the demolition of the wet bar to make room for lockers. We planned the conversion of the wine cellar into a secure server room for the dorm key database. We planned the transformation of the 3-car garage into a bicycle repair shop and laundry facility. It was a reverse heist. We weren't stealing the valuables. We were stealing the purpose. We were taking a structure designed to exclude the world and cracking it wide open. By the time we left, the sun was setting. The house was full of sticky notes and blue painter's tape. It didn't look like a mansion anymore. It looked like a project. The renovation timeline was aggressive. We had 60 days before the spring semester began. We hired local contractors, prioritizing those who were willing to work for cost plus labor in exchange for the publicity. We launched the marketing campaign a week later. We didn't mention my parents. We didn't mention the history. The press release was simple. Dorm Key and Second Foundation Housing announced the opening of the Willow Ridge Transitional Center. Safe, affordable housing for students facing financial estrangement, legal aid included. The buzz was immediate. The idea of taking a mansion in one of the state's wealthiest zip codes and turning it into a shelter for broke students was irresistible to the media. It was poetic justice. even if they didn't know the whole poem. Only Celia, Jalen, and Mr. Alvarez knew the truth. To everyone else, I was just the CEO making a bold real estate move. 3 weeks into the renovation, I received an email from the university. They wanted me to host the ribbon-cutting ceremony. They wanted me to be the first face the new residents saw. I accepted. That same afternoon, my phone pinged with a notification from a credit monitoring service I still kept, a habit from the days of paranoia. But this wasn't an alert for me, because I had blocked my parents from my accounts. I didn't get their updates, but I had set up a Google alert for their names, just to be safe. It was a public record update. Civil court filing. Gregory and Lydia Jones. Defendant. Claim. Unpaid rent and damages. Plaintiff. Airport View Apartments. I stared at the screen. They had moved into the apartment Brooke had screamed about, and now, less than 3 months later, they were already defaulting. They were repeating the cycle, but without the buffer of a $3 million asset to hide behind. The fall was faster now. The ground was closer. I closed the tab. I didn't feel the urge to call them. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. That was the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is chasing someone down to hurt them. Justice is simply holding your ground and letting them hurt themselves against the boundaries you set. I drove back to the house. My house that evening. The contractors had left for the day. The electricity was on. I walked into the living room. The drywall was up for the new partitions. The space felt smaller, cozier. It felt human. I stood in the center of the room and looked out the window at the dark driveway. In 2 months, 20 students would move in here. 20 kids who had been told they were burdens, liabilities, or investments gone wrong. They would walk through that door, and nobody would ask them for a cosigner. Nobody would check their credit score. They would just be handed a key. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own key. I tossed it in the air and caught it. The glass castle was gone. We were building a fortress of solitude no more. We were building a school. And the tuition? It was finally paid in full. The rain on the morning of the grand opening was a soft, gray drizzle, the kind that usually made Willow Ridge look melancholy. But today, the wet pavement didn't look gloomy. It looked clean. I stood under the new awning of what was once 104 Willow Ridge Drive. The brass house numbers had been removed. In their place was a sleek, modern sign made of brushed steel, the second foundation house. It did not look like a mansion anymore. The imposing iron gates were gone, replaced by an open, welcoming archway. The garage, which had once housed my father's collection of leased luxury SUVs, was now a glass-fronted bicycle repair shop and community laundry center. The windows, once draped in heavy velvet to keep the neighbors from looking in, were clear and uncovered, spilling warm light onto the wet driveway. Reporters from the Tulsa Gazette, the local television stations, and even a stringer from a national education blog were setting up their cameras. Representatives from Brookfield State University were mingling with the crowd, shaking hands with the first cohort of 20 residents, students we had identified through the dorm key database who were at high risk of homelessness due to financial abuse. I adjusted the lapel of my blazer. I was not hiding in the back. I was standing at the front, flanked by Jalen and Celia Grant. Then, I heard the shouting. It came from the street. A beat-up sedan had pulled up to the curb, half blocking the entrance. 2 figures emerged, neither of them dressed for the weather or the occasion. Lydia and Gregory Jones marched up the driveway, pushing past a startled cameraman. My mother was wearing a trench coat that had seen better days, and her hair was frizzy from the humidity. My father looked red-faced and indignant. They didn't see me. They only saw the building, their former crown jewel, being overrun by what they considered riffraff. "This is a disgrace," Gregory shouted at a young reporter who was trying to interview a student. "You cannot do this. This is a historic property. This is a residential neighborhood, not a homeless shelter." Lydia grabbed the arm of a university dean. "Do you know who lived here? Do you know the parties we threw? You are desecrating our legacy." The crowd went quiet. The cameras turned toward the commotion. It was a train wreck. and nobody could look away. I signaled to the security team to hold back. Let them speak. I thought, let them show the world exactly who they are. "Who is in charge here?" Gregory demanded, his voice cracking. "I want to speak to the owner. I want to know what vulture bought my house for pennies just to turn it into a flophouse." The master of ceremonies, a senior administrator from Brookfield State named Dr. Aris, stepped up to the microphone on the makeshift stage in the foyer. The sound system whined slightly, cutting through the humid air. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Aris said, his voice calm and amplified, "if we could settle down, please, we are here to mark a historic transition." Gregory and Lydia stopped shouting, panting slightly, looking vindicated. They thought the authority figure was stepping in to agree with them. "We are here to open the first Second Foundation House," Dr. Aris continued, "a sanctuary designed to break the cycle of financial exploitation, and it is my distinct honor to introduce the owner, the visionary, and the woman who bought this property to ensure that no student ever feels the cold chill of abandonment again." He paused. "Please welcome the CEO of Dorm Key, Jasmine Jones." The silence that followed was absolute. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I walked slowly up the 3 steps to the stage. I saw the moment it hit them. Lydia's hand flew to her mouth. Gregory's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. They stared at me. They looked at the house. They looked at the sign. The puzzle pieces slammed together in their minds with the force of a physical blow. The crowd followed their gaze. A few of the older donors and reporters recognized them. A murmur rippled through the room, a sound of shock and recognition. I stood at the podium. I didn't smile. I didn't look triumphant. I just looked steady. "Thank you, Dr. Aris," I said. I looked out at the audience, and then I let my gaze rest briefly on my parents. "When I was 18 years old," I said, my voice steady, "the people who were supposed to protect my future liquidated it. They took $60,000 of my tuition money to pay for a wedding. They viewed my education as a luxury, and their social status as a necessity." Lydia made a sound like a strangled whimper. Gregory looked like he wanted to run, but his feet were frozen to the pavement. For a long time, I continued. I thought that day was the end of my life. I thought that when the money vanished, I vanished. But I was wrong. That was not the day my life ended. That was the day I learned how to draw a new set of blueprints. I gestured to the room around us, the open walls, the study pods, the students holding their new keys. "We call this the Second Foundation House because sometimes the first foundation you are given is rotten," I said. "Sometimes the people who are supposed to hold you up are the ones pulling you down. And when that happens, you don't stay in the ruins. You build something new. You build something stronger. And you make sure the door is open for others coming up behind you." The applause started slowly, then swelled into a roar. The students were cheering. The reporters were flashing photos. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at my parents. They looked small. They looked irrelevant. They were standing in the shadow of the house they used to own. And they realized, finally, that the house had never been the source of power. The power was the person who held the key. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse into the tour groups, I stepped down from the stage. I walked toward the main hallway, where we had hung a large poster, "Free legal counseling for victims of familial financial abuse." Jasmine. They were waiting for me. They had not left. I stopped. I didn't turn around fully. I just angled my body toward them. Lydia's eyes were red. Gregory was wringing his hands, a nervous tic I had never seen before. "We didn't know," Lydia whispered. "We didn't know it was you." "Does it matter?" I asked. "Would you have shouted less if it was a stranger? Or does my success just make the failure taste more bitter?" Gregory stepped forward, trying to summon some of his old authority, but failing. "Jasmine, listen," he said, his voice hushed and urgent. This is impressive, really. We are proud. But you have to understand our situation, the apartment. The landlord is evicting us next week. We have nowhere to go." He looked around the gleaming lobby. You have 20 rooms here, he said. You have space. We are family. Surely, you can find a corner for us? Just until we get back on our feet, we can help manage the place. I know this house better than anyone. I stared at him. The audacity was so pure it was almost scientific. You want to live here? I asked. In a shelter for victims of financial abuse? Yes. Lydia nodded eagerly. It would be perfect. We could be the house parents. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a sharp, short sound. You are not the house parents, I said. You are the reason this house exists. You are the cautionary tale. I walked over to the reception desk and picked up a brochure. I handed it to Gregory. I am not going to put you in jail. I said, I have the evidence to send you there for the fraud, for the identity theft, for the forgery, but I am not going to use it. I am not going to sue you. I am not going to drag our name through the courts anymore. They both exhaled, looking relieved. That is my mercy, I said. Then I hardened my voice. But here is my justice. I am not giving you a cent. I am not giving you a room. I am not letting you step foot on this property again after today. You are not going to manage this house. You are not going to be house parents. You are going to leave. But Jasmine, Lydia cried, we will be on the street. Then you will figure it out, I said, just like I did. I pointed to the door. You took my tuition so Brooke could be a bride for a day. I said, I took this house so that kids like me can have a future for a lifetime. The ledger is balanced. The debt between us is paid. We are even. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the front entrance, where a young girl was standing. She was 18, wearing a faded backpack, looking terrified and hopeful all at once. Her name was Maya, and her parents had just kicked her out for refusing to co-sign a loan for a boat. I took a heavy brass key from my pocket. It wasn't the old key. It was a new one, cut for a new lock. Maya? I asked. She nodded, eyes wide. Welcome home, I said. I placed the key in her hand. She closed her fingers around it, and I saw the tension leave her shoulders. I walked her inside, and then I turned to the heavy oak door. My parents were standing on the porch, looking in through the glass, their faces pale ghosts in the reflection. I reached out and turned the deadbolt. Click. It was the loudest sound in the world. I walked away from the door, through the lobby, and out the back exit toward the university campus. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the people standing in the driveway. I had a meeting with an architect in 20 minutes. We were sketching the plans for the next house. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below where you are listening from. Share your thoughts on whether you think I was too harsh or if justice was served. And don't forget to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people.